completely at 25th day of intrauterine life. And the caudal end means the spinal cord fuses distally at 3 days later, 28th day of intrauterine life. 28th day intrauterine life. Okay. Now, look. This one was your mesoderm. So this is your notochord. This is your notochord. Just above the notochord is your neural tube. Notochord is a solid structure. Just above the notochord is your neural tube. Okay, and neural tube is accompanied by two another structures. The neural crest cell and ectodermal cord. Just above the neural tube is your surface ectoderm. Okay, and just beneath these structures are the endoderm. Okay, on the side of the lateral side of the notochord and the neural tube is your mesoderm. Lateral side is your mesoderm. Okay. This one is the mesoderm. Is it clear or not? Okay. Now look, the part of the mesoderm which lies just lateral to the neural tube or future brain and the spinal cord develops into the somite, which further develops into the mesenchyme. And what's the main function of this mesoderm? This specialized mesoderm. This mesoderm forms the covering of neural tube. This mesoderm forms the covering of neural tube. I told you the neural tube forms the central nervous system, means the neural tube forms the brain and the spinal cord. So these mesenchymes form the coverings of the neural tube, means the mesenchyme on the cranial end forms the skull, and on distal end the mesenchyme forms the vertebral. Is this clear or not? Clear. Now, all these structures, the mesenchyme along with the neural group, they start fusing at both the ends simultaneously. Okay, the mesenchyme and the neural group develop simultaneously. Both the ends of the neural group start fusing at each other, and also the mesenchyme, both the ends start fusing with each other simultaneously to form the complete skull and the vertebral column. Okay. Now, if there is a defect in cranial fusion means this end fusion. Okay, if there's a defect in cranial fusion of the neural tube along with the mesenchyme, then the brain and the skull are not complete, underdeveloped. Okay, and the brain is exposed to the environment. There is no skull. And this situation is called no cephaly. No cephaly. Cephaly means brain. No cephaly or no brain. Absence of brain called anencephaly. Okay. This condition is called anencephaly. Okay. This condition is called anencephaly. Okay. Similar condition, similar situation if occurs in the caudal end if defect in fusion of caudal end of neural tube along with vertebral column occurs, then it develops into rachis. Rachis. This problem is called rachis. In this, the spinal cord doesn't form a tube-like structure. The spinal cord is open like this. Okay, and the vertebral column is also open like this. There is no spine of the vertebra. There is no lamina of the vertebra. Okay, the vertebral column is open like this on the dorsum of the baby. Okay. Now, these are the defects where the spinal cord is also defective. The notochord is also defective in fusion. If only mesenchyme in distal end or caudal end fails to fuse. If the mesenchyme in distal end fails to fuse, then the spinal cord, which is developed from the notochord, is okay. Spinal cord is okay. It's well developed. But the vertebral column is not fused. So there should be a single spine like this of the vertebra. There should be a single spine. This one is the vertebral canal. This should be the single spine like this. But here, this is the body of the vertebra. Both the spines are not fused and the spines are open like this. And this condition is called two spine condition or spina bifida. So spina bifida is the defect in the fusion of mesenchyme only. Okay, defect in fusion of mesenchyme only. Now, if the spine is not fused, then there may be a condition where, look, this is the vertebral column. This is the body of the vertebra. Here should be your spinal cord with the spinal canal or central canal. Okay, this is the spinal cord. This is the vertebra. Okay, here is your skin. Now, here is a condition where the spinal cord is okay, only the vertebral spine is not fused and the spinal cord is in the correct position. It do not bulge towards the surface. Okay. So in this condition, you cannot diagnose that there is a underlying malformation of the spina bifida because from the superficial view, there is no deformity. The surface ectoderm is intact, like normal person. Okay. Only a tuft of hair is present at the back at the spina bifida position. Okay. And this manifestation is hidden or this manifestation is latent. This manifestation is accidental. You cannot diagnose this patient from superficial view. Okay. So this manifestation is hidden, and the word which is used for the hidden is occult. So this one is called spina bifida occulta. Okay. And if the spinal cord moves towards the skin, then there will be a bulge in the skin which will manifest the spina bifida, and this is called spina bifida manifesta. Okay. Now in the spina bifida manifesta, there is a bulging on the dorsum of the baby. Okay. So it's clear that the spine is not fused now. This is the body. Spine is not fused now. Okay. If this is the skin of the baby, if the spinal cord is present in its normal location, only the meninges bulge towards the skin. This is the covering of the spinal cord only bulge towards the skin. Then, if you illuminate a light here, then this fluid will look transparent. This fluid will look transparent. Okay, this bulge will look transparent. Okay, or this will illuminate because this is filled with CSF and no solid structure is present here. Only CSF and a pouch. So this one is called spina bifida with meningocele, meninges on meningocele. Cele word is used for the cyst, and meninges present means spina bifida meningocele. Okay. Now, if along with the meninges, the spinal cord also invaginates into this cavity, then when you put the torch on this cavity or in this swelling, this one will not illuminate. There will be some blood vessels present on this swelling, looking like a solid structure. And this condition is called meninges is present, meningomyelocele. Spina bifida with meningomyelocele. Okay. Now look. When the neural group invaginates to form the neural tube, it takes some part of the fluid which is present on the dorsum of it. And the fluid which is present on dorsum of it is the amniotic fluid. Now, the neural group invaginates into the mesoderm and then fuse at both the edges to form a single cavity. And this cavity is called the central cavity of the spinal cord and the ventricles of the brain. And within the spinal cord central cavity and the ventricle of the brain, there's a fluid called the CSF, cerebrospinal fluid. So the past cerebrospinal fluid is the amniotic fluid, which is taken by the neural group while invaginating into the mesoderm. Okay, so the past CSF is your amniotic fluid. Later on, the CSF is formed by the choroid plexus. Later, the CSF is formed by the choroid plexus. Clear? Now, look. Your whole brain holds upon itself. Your whole brain holds upon itself. Your brain in embryologic life is like this, the neural tube. Okay, it folds upon itself like a C segment. Okay, I'll tell you later. Fast, fast. Now the neural tube loop. Now the neural tube is formed. Okay, now the neural tube is formed like this, a tubular structure. This one is your neural tube. You know, upper part forms the brain and the lower part forms the spinal cord. Now, the brain portion of the neural tube forms three primary bulges. The brain part forms three primary bulges like this, and like this. The brain part of the neural tube forms the three primary bulges. These are the primary bulges. Bulges means, look, this is a tube. Now there occurs three great swelling, three big swelling in the upper part of your neural tube. Okay. Now the uppermost or cranial most swelling is called the prosencephalon. Prosencephalon. The cranial most is called the prosencephalon. The middle one is called the mesencephalon, and the hind part or the distalmost part of the forebrain portion called the rhombencephalon. Okay. Now this prosencephalon part forms the forebrain. There are three parts of your brain. One is the forebrain, one is the midbrain, another one is the hindbrain. Okay. Forebrain is the cortex and the basal ganglia, and the hippocampus, the cortex part mainly. The cortex and the basal ganglia, forebrain. Cortex, basal ganglia, thalamus, epithalamus, hypothalamus, all these things which lie within the cortex. Okay, these are the forebrain. Then the midbrain comes, which is attached to the forebrain. Then comes the hindbrain or the rhombencephalon, hindbrain, the distal brain. And the distal brain consists of the pons, medulla, cerebellum. Okay, the brainstem part, the brainstem and the cerebellum. Okay, so the prosencephalon forms the forebrain, the mesencephalon forms the midbrain. Okay, and the rhombencephalon forms the hindbrain, the distal. Okay, now these are the primary bulges. Again, these bulges form secondary bulges. The bulges develop upon the primary bulges are called the secondary bulges. Okay, now this prosencephalon again develop into two secondary bulges on each side. Okay, the uppermost bulge is called the telencephalon. Uppermost part is called the telencephalon, and the lower bulge of the forebrain bulge, the prosencephalon. These are the two bulges of your prosencephalon. Okay, the uppermost part is the telencephalon, and the lower one is the diencephalon. Diencephalon. Okay, so both are the bulges of your forebrain. So these are the bulges of your forebrain. Okay. Now, the mesencephalon do not form any secondary bulges. So the mesencephalon goes like this, having a single bulge, primary bulge. Okay. Now the rhombencephalon again divides into two secondary bulges. Again divides into two secondary bulges. The uppermost part of the rhombencephalon forms the metencephalon. Metencephalon. This one is telencephalon. Then comes the diencephalon. This is the mesencephalon. 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 Then comes the metencephalon. And last bulge is the myelencephalon. Myelencephalon. Okay. Now the distal part forms the spinal cord. Okay. And the middle. Now the middle one goes as such without forming any secondary bulges. So this is the mesencephalon forming a secondary bulge. This is the mesencephalon. And the hind part, this one is the hind part. The hind part again forms two secondary bulges. The upper one is called the metencephalon, and the lower one is called the myelencephalon. The lower one is called the myelencephalon. Okay. Now, the telencephalon, the upper part, develops into cerebrum and basal ganglia. Cerebrum and the basal ganglia. Okay. The diencephalon part forms all the structures related to thalamus, like the thalamus, epithalamus, hypothalamus, sub or below to thalamus, subthalamus, optic knob. I told you optic knob develops from diencephalon. Optic knob. Look, olfactory knob develops from telencephalon. Olfactory knob develops from telencephalon, like this. This one is olfactory knob. Here is optic knob. Here is your optic knob. Optic knob along with retina. Ciliary body, iris, pituitary. Okay, pituitary which portion? Neurohypophysis portion, because the hypothalamus descends into the neurohypophysis. Okay, so this diencephalon part forms the thalamus, epithalamus, hypothalamus, subthalamus, optic knob, retina, ciliary body, iris, etc. Okay. Now the mesencephalon forms the midbrain. Okay. Now the telencephalon, now the metencephalon forms the pons. First it forms the pons, then develops the cerebellum. Okay, and the myelencephalon develops into medulla oblongata. Clear? Up to this, clear or not? The uppermost part, the prosencephalon, forms the forebrain. Forebrain consists of the brain proper. Okay. Again, the prosencephalon divides into two more balls. The uppermost ball is called the telencephalon. The lower one is called the diencephalon. The telencephalon develops into the cerebrum and the basal ganglia, and the diencephalon develops into the thalamus, epithalamus, hypothalamus, okay, subthalamus, optic nerve, iris, ciliary body, and pituitary hypophysis, neurohypophysis. Then comes the midbrain portion, the mesencephalon. Okay, it doesn't divide further. Then comes the hindbrain portion. The hindbrain again divides into two more structures. One is the metencephalon, and another one is the myelencephalon. The meten one, upper one, forms the pons along with the medulla, pons along with the cerebellum, and the lower one forms the medulla oblongata, and the distal portion forms the spinal cord. After this, clear? Clear. Now look, your brain develops like this. Your brain develops like this in a tube-like structure. Okay. Now the brain folds upon itself. Up to this, your brain is a straight structure. Your brain is a straight structure. Now your brain folds upon itself to form a C-like structure. Okay. And first, the axis of the fold, the thalamus forms the axis of brain folding. Okay. After this, the brain was a single linear tube-like structure. Now the brain folds upon itself to form a C-like structure. Okay, and the thalamus forms the axis. Okay. Now, this is the thalamus. Okay. Upon this thalamus, the brain folds upon itself like this. Okay. Brain folds upon itself like this. Okay. Now, along with the brain here, there occurs another folding of another basal ganglia structure called the caudate nucleus. So, the caudate nucleus also folds upon the thalamus to form a C-like structure. Both the ends of the caudate nucleus face anteriorly. Okay. Now, look, both the hemispheres of the brain are joined by some axonal fibers. And these axonal fibers are called the commissural fibers. Okay. And the first commissural fiber to develop are called the commissural fibers. And what are the commissural fibers? Commissural fibers mean join to cerebral hemisphere. Okay, and the first commissural fiber to develop is the anterior commissure. Develop is the anterior commissure. The anterior commissure is present here. It joins anteriorly to both the cerebrum. This is the anterior commissure. Okay. Now, this is the temporal lobe. This one is the temporal lobe. Okay. Temporal lobe cortex. There is a specialized temporal lobe cortex called the hippocampus. Specialized part of the temporal lobe called the hippocampus. Okay. Now look, There are three commissure fibers. One is the anterior commissure, another one is your corpus callosum, the big commissure fiber which joins the both the hemisphere. Okay, another one is then develops the corpus callosum, and then develops your fornix. Okay, now look, this one is the hippocampus, the specialized temporal lobe. Okay, and this hippocampus is the site for short-term memory. Whatever you are reading now is stored in your short-term memory in the hippocampus. The hippocampus. And when you revise this thing again and again, this thing sort now this one is stored in short-term memory in hippocampus. Okay, now when you revise the thing again and again, the hippocampus sends the impulse to another structure which is present posteriorly called the mammillary body. This is called the mammillary body. This is called the mammillary body. From the mammillary body, the fibers goes from the mammillary body. The fibers goes to the hypothalamus. To the hypothalamus. Now, from the mammillary body, the fibers goes to hypothalamus. Anterior portion of the thalamus. Anterior portion of the thalamus. And from the anterior portion, the fibers goes to cingulate gyrus. Cingulate. Cingulate gyrus is a specialized cortex like the hippocampus. Okay. Now, this cingulate gyrus again send the fibers to hippocampus. Okay. And the long-term memory is stored in cingulate gyrus. So you have to revise again and again so that these many fibers will be stimulated to reach the information to cingulate gyrus. And here the short-term memory which are stored in the hippocampus will be stored as the long-term memory. Okay. Now this circuit, this cycle-like structure, the whole circuit means a round complete cycle, is called the Papage circuit. Papage circuit. Papage circuit. And Papage circuit is the memory circuit. Memory circuit. Okay. And the Papage circuit starts from the hippocampus. Then it goes to the mammillary body. MB means mammillary body. Then it goes to hypothalamus. Then it goes to anterior portion of the thalamus. Then it goes to the cingulate gyrus. Then it comes to hippocampus. Okay. So the Papage circuit starts from the short-term memory region of hippocampus. It goes to mammillary body. Then it goes to the hypothalamus. Then it goes to anterior portion of the thalamus. Then it goes to cingulate gyrus. Then it comes back to hippocampus. And this is the circuit. Okay. Now let's have a look at the ventricles. Okay. Now look at the ventricles. Now, what are the ventricles actually? The ventricles is the neural tube cavity. Okay. The neural tube encloses a cavity-like structure This is called the ventricle. Okay, the neural tube encloses a cavity-like structure called the ventricles and the central canal. So the neural tube develops into brain and the spinal cord. Okay, so the brain part of the neural tube develops into ventricle, neural tube cavity, and the neural tube cavity, which is present in spinal cord part, develops into central. Okay, now look. Okay, I told you that this is the neural tube. This one is the neural tube, and these are the swellings of the neural tube. Okay, these swellings. Okay, so this uppermost swelling is the telencephalon, then comes the diencephalon, and then comes the midbrain, then comes the metencephalon, and then comes the myelencephalon. Okay, so the telencephalon, all these things are the neural tube swellings. Okay, and mid portion is the cavity. Mid portion is the cavity. Okay, and the cavity contains the CSF fluid. The cavity contains the CSF fluid. Okay, now the portion of the cavity. This is the cavity. The portion of the cavity which is present at telencephalon region. The portion of the cavity which is present at the telencephalon region forms the lateral ventricle. A portion of the neural tube cavity which is present at the telencephalon region means which is present inside the cerebral cortex forms the lateral ventricle. Now the portion of the neural tube cavity which is present at the diencephalon region. Diencephalon region means in between the thalamus, the portion of the neural tube cavity, diencephalon forms the thalamus. Okay. Now the portion of the neural tube cavity which is present in between the thalamus, in between the two thalamus. Now look, both the thalami are present medial portion of the cerebrum. Okay. So in between the thalami, the portion of the neural tube cavity is called the third ventricle. The third ventricle. Okay. Now the midbrain portion of the neural tube cavity forms the aqueduct of Sylvius. The midbrain portion of the neural tube cavity, this portion is called the aqueduct of Sylvius. Okay. Now the whole hindbrain portion forms a diamond-shaped ventricle. The whole hindbrain portion forms a diamond-shaped cavity called the fourth ventricle. Okay. Now this canal continues as the central canal inside spinal cord. Central canal of spinal cord. Up to this clear or not? The lateral ventricle is present within the cerebrum. Okay, and the cerebrum is present in telencephalon. So the telencephalon part of the neural tube cavity forms the lateral ventricle. The diencephalon part of the ventricle, while some part of the neural tube cavity forms the third ventricle. The lateral ventricles are also called the second ventricle. There are two lateral ventricles. Okay, so they are called the second ventricle. This is the third ventricle. First, second ventricle are named according to the cerebrum. Okay, the first and the second are the cerebral ventricles. The third one is present in the diencephalon and in between the thalamus. Okay, next comes the aqueduct sylvius. The part of the neural cavity which is present in the midbrain is called the aqueduct sylvius. And the part of the neurotic cavity in the hindbrain is called the fourth ventricle. Okay, now the second ventricle or the lateral ventricle communicates with the third one through a opening called foramen of Monro. Foramen of Monro. Okay. Now the third ventricle communicates with the fourth ventricle. This is fourth. This one is third, and the third one communicates with the fourth ventricle by the aqueduct of Sylvius. Okay. Now the fourth ventricle is sandwiched. The fourth ventricle is sandwiched between cerebellum above and brainstem below. And look, your fourth ventricle is present in the dorsum of your body, and your brainstem is present anteriorly, and on the dorsum of the brainstem is your cerebellum. Your cerebellum is present posteriorly. Okay, and in between the brainstem and the cerebellum is your fourth ventricle. So the roof of the fourth ventricle is formed by the cerebellum, and the floor is formed by the brainstem. The brainstem is present anteriorly, and the cerebellum is present posteriorly, and in between these two structures is your fourth ventricle. So cerebellum forms the roof, brainstem forms the floor. Actually, brainstem is the lower half of pons and upper half of medulla oblongata forms the floor. Okay. Now the CSF is secreted. Mainly in the lateral ventricles from the choroid plexus. The CSF is secreted mainly from the lateral ventricle through the choroid plexus. And the choroid plexuses are the plexuses or the bunch of arteries, at the roof of the lateral ventricle, and they ultrafiltrate the blood to form the CSF. And now the CSF is present in lateral ventricle. CSF is formed in the lateral ventricle mainly at the roof by the choroid plexus, and now the CSF leaks into the lateral ventricle. From the lateral ventricle, the CSF goes to the third ventricle through a foramen called foramen of Monro. From the third ventricle, the CSF runs downward to the fourth ventricle through active aqueduct of Sylvius, through a canal-like structure called aqueduct of Sylvius. Now the CSF is present in fourth ventricle. Okay. Now, on the roof of the fourth ventricle is your cerebellum. Okay. And on the roof of the fourth ventricle, there are three openings. Look, this is the roof. I have removed the cerebellum. You are looking from the dorsum of the body. I have removed the cerebellum. So you are viewing the fourth ventricle. Okay. Now, on the roof of the fourth ventricle, you have three openings towards the cerebellum. Okay. Now, two are present laterally. These are called foramen of Laska. and the one which is present in midline is called foramen of Magendie. Now L for L is present laterally, L for L, and M for M is present on midline. Okay. Now the CSF is present in fourth ventricle. This foramina open into subarachnoid space. In subarachnoid space, you have the CSF. Okay. Now CSF is mainly synthesized in the ventricles, and through the aqueduct of Sylvius, the CSF reaches to the fourth ventricle, and from the fourth ventricle, the CSF goes to the subarachnoid space through these two foramina. Okay. Now the foramina, the lateral one is the foramen of Laska, and the middle one is the foramen of Magendie. Okay. Now the CSF is present in subarachnoid space. Okay. From the subarachnoid space, the CSF goes to the large venous sinuses like the dural sinuses through the arachnoid granulations. Okay. Now look. As the CSF is synthesized in first, the CSF is synthesized from choroid plexus, in lateral ventricle. Okay. Now through foramen of Monro, the CSF goes to the third ventricle. From the third ventricle, it goes to the fourth ventricle through aqueduct of Sylvius. From the fourth ventricle, it goes to subarachnoid space through foramen of Laska and Magendie. And these foramina are present on the roof of fourth ventricle. Now the CSF is present in subarachnoid space. Now the CSF goes to your great dural sinuses, the subdural venous sinuses, because ultimately the CSF has to be drained into the venous sinuses. Okay. Subdural venous sinuses through the arachnoid granulations. And these arachnoid granulations are actually some modification of the veins which absorb the CSF into the venous sinuses. Okay. So this is the flow of your CSF from synthesis to the drainage. Okay. If there is aqueduct stenosis or blockage of the aqueduct, then there will be swelling of the third ventricle. Okay. And there will be swelling of the lateral ventricle also. Okay. Forming hydrocephalus.